Arsym cupped his chin, pondering his best course of action. He cast a glance over to Lilym, a young woman who had been his lifelong friend, lying pale against a large tree. It was clear her wound was infected, whether by poison or the elements, he wasn't quite sure. Surveying the immediate area, he recognized some of the local flora and determined that they were probably somewhere deep in the southern forest of Nadriel. Arsym felt some pressure ease as he reclaimed his bearings in the large world after being carried off by whoever those figures were. He shook off his short-lived relief and quickly began scouring for kensage, an uncommon herb often found underneath the hollows of trees, particularly so if it had black speckled mushrooms nearby it. He did his best to keep an eye on his friend, but after immediate area proved fruitless, he had to venture out of line of sight. Damn it, there has to be some, please. Arsym began losing what little composure he had as he began grasping plants around the small mushroom beds, yanking them up to examine them more closely. A sharp pain pierced the back of his right shoulder, and an unexpected weight forced him forward. Arsym quickly spun and delivered an elbow into whatever had bitten him. The elbow found no purchase, and the weight bearing down on his back suddenly vanished. His hand instinctively went to his shoulder to assess the damage. Whatever bit him, bit hard. Quickly looking around him for whatever had attacked him, a dog shrouded in a hazy black coat appeared directly in front of him, seemingly out of thin air, and locked onto the same shoulder, mere inches from his neck. Arsym grabbed at one side of the animal and started delivering blows. The creature vanished just as quickly as it had manifested, escaping his grip. In his mania to save his friend, he hadn't noticed the large dog-like creature sneak up on him, but now it was starting to make more sense, seeing that whatever this thing was didn't seem to follow the same rules of existence as most. He recalled a tale a hunter had told him about a wolf that danced on the wind, said that he couldn't hit it no matter how many arrows he sent in its direction, and it always seemed to close the distance he put between them before so much as a blink of his eye. Knocking the final arrow in his quiver, the creature appeared and bit into his wrist, and he said the equivalent to a swear in Sylvan. Arsym spat on the ground in frustration, trying to recall what exactly that word was. His dagger now poised, he did his best to make his neck as small a target as possible, and waited for the inevitable bite that he couldn't surmise a pattern to. What seemed like an eternity passed in a few moments, and finally he felt the air shift ever so slightly behind him. He made a reckless leap forward as the creature appeared behind him, the teeth audibly snapping in the air. He quickly reset his bearings and lunged at the creature, narrowly missing it as it vanished again, and appeared just above him. It bit hard at the back of his head. Doing his best to ignore the pain, he twisted his body and managed to find purchase in its flank. The hairs on his neck felt sensitive to the air, and Arsym was sure it was about to shift again. But the energy quickly faded, and the creature collapsed, whimpering to the ground behind him. Assessing that the danger had passed, Arsym quickly began rendering aid to his wounds. "What is this thing?" he said, pawing it with his foot. A detail that had eluded him in his own peril occurred to him. Lilym was alone. How could he have been so foolish? Arsym quickly darted towards the small clearing where he had left Lilyn, and collapsed to the ground in realization that she was gone. The only thing lying on the ground were a few strands of hair. Looking above, he noticed the tree had a large scorch mark on it, and some blood was visible along the edges of some of the grass. Maybe she was still alive. He went to his hands and knees and desperately looked for some sign, more direction, anything. Nothing. There was nothing, save that hair, burn mark, and a bit of blood nearby in the grass. The hunters had taught him that animals always leave tracks. You just had to know how to read them. The only exception was that far-fetched story of the vanishing dog, which now had some great merit as far as he was concerned. He couldn't help but fear for the worst, knowing that creatures like that hunted in this area. The people en masse seemingly appeared from the shadows of the room. Maybe they had taken her. He much preferred the thought of that in comparison to some wild animal getting a hold of her. His legs felt weak given recent events, and his stomach began speaking despite the urgency of the situation. He hadn't eaten in 2 days now. He wanted to find Lilyn, but trekking the forest without direction with creatures like that was certain death, especially in his condition. The dog was still where he had slain it. Kneeling down, he began the process of butchering some of the meat. Not a few minutes into the task, he had heard what sounded like a strange cross between a chicken and a dog yapping. Arsym slowly made his way over. The growing cacophony only furthered as he grew closer to the point. There was a small hollow, no more than 15 yards away, hidden under some brush growing in front of a tree. 3 small creatures similar to that animal from earlier phased around the small hole, appearing atop one another and clumsily collapsing doing so. Seems she was only protecting a young. Arsym thought to himself, a bit disappointed that he had taken away the mother of these innocent pups. He pulled himself away and went back over to finishing the task at hand. Survival comes first. It has to. He had decided to leave most of the organs and drain the blood before slinging the body over his aching shoulder, heading back to that same clearing. He figured one of two things would happen. He could enjoy his meal in peace, or whatever had taken Lilith would come back. Either way, he was nourished and would possibly find whoever took her away from him. Weighed against the danger, it was a calculated risk worth taking. There were plenty of offerings from many trees nearby. Gathering the many branches and twigs took no more than a minute. He arranged them neatly and quickly found himself reminiscing about the small flame he produced with a few gestures of his hands and a large breath that cooled his lungs with the energy of the world around him. It was the middle of winter. He and Lillian had run off towards the fairgrounds, where they could usually enjoy the company of one another without the ordeal of passerbys giving them looks or the occasional sneer. They had been sculpting farm animals in the snow when the wind picked up and started nipping at them a bit too much for comfort. They had a secret spot not too far, a cave mouth that didn't go very deep, but hid them from the elements enough to shelter them for the night. They picked up wood along the way, complaining to each other about how cold it was, and poking fun at who had made the best sculpture. It wasn't long before they arrived, and they both set to building the pyre. Once it was together, Lillian cupped her hands, and a faint orange glow emanated from the inside of them. She blew, and a small cloud of fire enveloped the wood and lit up the cave. "You've got to teach me that," Arsym said, staring slack-jawed at his friend. "As if you could pull off pyromancy." A playful smile danced across Lillian's face. They sat for a moment, laughing about the day's affairs and Cassandra's many musings of healing magics. They gradually went from sitting across from one another to beside each other. As the fire started to dwindle, Lillian had taken him into her arms, and Arsym would have sworn she glowed with the same radiance he had seen dancing in the flames. His consciousness came back to him as he speared a piece of dog meat, and a grin crossed his face, remembering their night together. Turning the morsel over, he couldn't help but second-guess if not running aimlessly into the forest searching for her wasn't the best course of action. He fancied himself more logical and calculating than to let his emotions overtake him. What good could he have done if he had lost his sense of direction? More of those dogs might have ambushed him, or maybe even something worse, like an owlbear. He wouldn't have stood a chance against one of those. He continued making excuses to his decision and then noticed that some of the meat he had stripped was gone. Looking around, he didn't see anything, and was sure he had put more beside him than what was now there. His hand went to scratch his head, and when what looked like a pup from before appeared and crashed beside the pile, he reached out to grab it, but it disappeared off just before he got his hands around it. The little scamp was pretty quick, but it was clearly clumsy. He saw it appear not too far off, looking in the direction of the meat and himself. Its priorities were clear. He quickly gathered up what meat he could from the pile and put it back into the makeshift pouch he had fashioned from some of the skin of the mother. Pulling out a small piece, he held it directly in front of him towards the dog. It appeared not too far away, slowly inched forward, and then tore off a piece of the meat, greedily eating it, and then warping back to just beyond the clearing. This went on for a few hours, with little nibbles and Arsym slowly trying to win the little scamp's trust. The sun was still fairly high, and Arsym figured his next best course of action would be to try and sneak back into the keep where those masked figures had been. Reorienting himself, he started towards the direction they had run from the night before. He crossed the small ravine and made his way to a fairly sheer hill that he assumed he had fallen from. The hill was about 5 feet high, and had many logs and small boulders beneath it. He pulled himself on top of one of the large boulders and passed along to the upper embankment. As his eyes went from his intended landing spot back to the small building in the distance, he saw the little scamp again. Almost tripping over his own legs, he caught himself on a nearby tree. "You following me, little fella? There isn't much for you where I'm going, and I'm not giving you more food." The dog playfully cocked its head and vanished. Not a moment later, he felt something drop on top of his head and give out a little yap. Arsym tried to make a grab at it, but it phased away the second his hand went up for it. "This is serious. You could get us both killed." A few moments passed, and eventually the little guy appeared just in front of Arsym. "Finally tuckered yourself out." The pup panted a few times and looked up at him. Against his better judgment, he decided to pull out a third of the meat and placed it in front of the dog. It began nibbling at it, and he took the opportunity to get away. Checking behind him along the way, he made his way to the structure. He arrived without his little follower and looked up at the building. It was maybe 30 yards wide and another 30 deep, comprised of wood and stone that abundance the area. There weren't any windows, only a single door made of metal that led into the structure. Here goes nothing. Arsym pushed open the door slowly, trying his best to mitigate the terrible screech that the rust on the hinges produced. The inside was fairly well lit with the small sconces. The immediate room was fairly plain, mostly the same stone, wood, and 2 other doors leading either direction. He made his way to the left door and placed his ear. Nothing was audible. He slowly pushed open the door and revealed that same cell area he had found himself in the night before. He immediately noticed a large mound of fur in the corner cell, and it took not a moment longer to realize that there was a large owlbear sleeping in the corner cell, the door visibly open. How the hell did that thing get in here? Arsym quickly backstepped and closed the door back. Damn it, what if Lillian's in there? He swallowed hard and spent a long moment contemplating just how stupid an idea this was. He slowly pushed open the door. At a glance, he didn't see anything save that large furry mound. He raised his foot and ever so diligently placed a toe in front of him into the room. And it's a fun cue. The creature began to stand. Shit! Arsym began to sweat vigorously and did his best to reposition his foot out the door. The owlbear was still looking towards the back wall in the opposite direction of the door. Arsym slowly pulled the door back and left it cracked just enough to peek inside. It didn't seem to move, just kept staring at the wall until finally laying back down into position. A loud yap caused him to fall forward into the door, startling him to the point his heart leapt from his chest, and he saw the dog behind him, but quickly turned to the form of the owlbear ahead. It stood up, and had turned, and was now looking in their direction. A loud growl enveloped the room, and the fear left Arsym paralyzed on the floor. Every time he willed himself to his feet, they would buckle beneath him. The fear was so palpable, he hadn't even noticed that the pup was licking his hand and wagging its tail, oblivious to the peril they were in. A growl tore through the chamber again. The ground grew slightly wet around him as he tried his best to clamber back to the door without taking his eyes off of the beast. A piercing pain snapped him out of his fear-filled stupor, and what was an owlbear quickly became a pile of fur and linen. Arsym looked down at the pup, who stood in front of him wagging its tail. He stared back to the fur pile in disbelief. He couldn't have been more sure that its life was at a close. He reached out, pulled the little scamp to his chest. "Thank you, friend." With that, the dog blinked in front of him and ran towards the back area. He pulled himself to his feet and only then realized that he had soiled himself. Well, this isn't embarrassing. He let out a large sigh and pressed forward cautiously. Looking around, there didn't seem to be anything other than the large fur piles towards the back of the room. Looking at it, he couldn't even imagine how he could have mistaken a harmless pile of linen and a few animal skins for an owlbear. Maybe he was a little more tired than he thought. He immediately started going through it as the pup sniffed at each article he tossed aside. He found a pair of leggings that seemed a reasonable fit and were much cleaner given the circumstance. Pawing through, he also found a small scrolled-up piece of paper. As he picked it up, a scarlet seal started to give off some smoke, and he quickly threw the scroll across the floor. It stopped fizzing, and the parchment lay on the ground unraveled, with a small key inside of it. He walked over and picked them both up. "Looks like you figured me out. Good thing, too. Claim your prize. I'll be waiting for you, my pet," was written in a smudgy red substance, and a drawing of a one-eyed rat appeared on the bottom of the note just as he finished the last letter. "I'm sure of it. These bastards have Lillian. Why else would they have expected me back? No idea where to look for them, though. There has to be more to this." With that, he fashioned a large bag out of some of the linen and wrapped some of the animal skins along with another pair of clothes that were too large for him, but better than not to have anything should the need arise. He headed back towards the main corridor and realized he hadn't seen the other room. He set down the makeshift bag he had fashioned and went towards the door. He cautiously pulled it open, revealing a small room with a single table centered in it. Atop it was a single sheet of paper, ink, and a quill, along with a large, ornate box. He picked up the parchment. "We'll await your arrival at the Red Mead's Tavern in Elkswood." An eloquently drawn map to the location was just below the note, and just below that the signature, "Wolf of the Elm." As he was reading, the pup appeared on the table and knocked over the ink pot. "No!" Arsym quickly began trying to wipe off the excess ink, but to no avail. The document was ruined. Damn it! A tear escaped his eye in frustration of possibly having lost his only lead. After a moment, the paper seemed to absorb the ink, and again it appeared as it had before. The text that was above the map portion had changed. I wouldn't waste perfectly good ink. The pen is often stronger than the sword. Arsym again stared in disbelief at the piece of paper. He actually had heard about something like this from his mother, a piece of paper that could communicate to a similar parchment to which it was linked. Arsym took the quill and tried to dig the rest of the ink out of the pot. He fervently wrote, "Do you have Lilin?" And with that, the words soaked into the paper before changing into one large word. Maybe. Arsym couldn't hold back his frustration and slammed his fist into the table. He tried to ascertain more ink, but it was clearly dry. Reopening the small wound on his hand, he winced as he dipped the quill into his own blood. "Don't harm her, or I swear I'll kill all of you." The blood soaked into the note, and a cartoonishly drawn fox head appeared, its tongue lashing its maw. "Not if you don't deal with our little champion," was scrawled just beneath it. Looking up at the box, he remembered the key and went into the hallway to grab his bag. He procured the key and placed it into the large ornate box. Inside was a clump of Lilin's hair and a large mass that reminded Arsym of the rats that ran around the fairgrounds feasting on leftovers after the celebrations. Upon removing the items, he noticed the lid of the box also had a mirror embedded into it. He felt compelled to put on this mask, and as he raised it to its face, it almost seemed to form perfectly to it, as if it were made for him. He quickly took it off and looked down at it. Something made him uneasy about it, but he couldn't help but feel it was important. His new friend yapped at him, and he realized it was time to save Lilin. Dear listeners, our story has once again come to a point of decision. Should Arsym leave the mask? Take it with him? Shatter it? Let's write a story. Let's play a game without the dice.